Okay, welcome to this meeting of the Local Plan Working Group, the virtual meeting of Tuesday the 20th of October. Start with apologies I've received from Councillor Doughty, and Councillor Rowley is with us today. I've had apologies from Councillor Orrell, and Councillor Daubney is with us, and I've had apologies from Councillor Perrott, and Councillor Melly is with us. Turning to item 1 on the agenda, does anybody have any declarations of interest? Okay. Item 2 on the agenda is to approve the minutes of the Local Plan Working Group held on the 21st of August 2020. Is everyone happy to accept those as a correct record? Thank you very much. Item 3, public participation. We have no members of the public registered to speak, which is most unusual for Local Plan Working Groups, but well, we won't take it personally. And so we'll go straight into substantive items, which is the first one is item number 4, the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan Examiner's Report and Proposed Modifications. I'll hand over to Mike Slater to do a short introduction and introduce the relevant officers.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members and colleagues. We've got 3 reports for you this afternoon. The first 2 reports are going to go to the executive later on in the week for consideration, following your input and for decision, hopefully. The third report is an update on the York local plan. The first 2 will be introduced by colleagues. Item 4, the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan Examiner's Report and Modifications. My colleague Anna Pawson is going to introduce that one. The next one is introduced by Francis Harrison, and myself and Alison will talk to the report on the update on the local plan, if that's okay with everyone. Yep, I'll take silence to be a yes, so I'll hand over to Anna, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, this report relates to the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan examination, which concluded in February this year, and further modifications officers propose in addition to those presented by the examiner. Firstly, I would just like to say that we really appreciate all the hard work and dedication that the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan Group has put into this process, which has produced a locally representative document detailing the issues which affect the Huntington parish. The examiner's report was received by the council on the 21st of February of this year and can be seen at Annex A to this report. Overall, the examiner recommends to the council that, subject to the incorporation of modifications set out in his report, that the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan should proceed to referendum. The examiner's report includes a series of modifications which are summarised in the report and are set out at Annex B. Due to the pandemic, officers have been delayed in presenting this report to members. As set out in our report, since the conclusion of the examination, there has been a High Court judgment relevant to decisions in relation to York's Greenbelt ahead of the adoption of the local plan, and a threatened legal challenge against the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan. The council has received the outcome of the High Court judgment, which was the Christopher Wedgwood v City of York Council judgment in March of this year, which clarified the approach to Greenbelt decision making in advance of the adoption of the boundaries in the local plan. This clarifies that decisions in advance of the adoption on whether to treat land as falling within Greenbelt for development management purposes should be taken into account the general extent of the Greenbelt in the RSS, the draft local plan from April 2005, the emerging local plan, and also site-specific features in deciding whether land should be regarded as Greenbelt. It's proposed that the outcome of this judgment should be reflected in the neighbourhood plan in order to secure that the plan meets the basic conditions. In line with the relevant regulations, the council does have capacity to modify the report if required, where we propose to make a decision which differs from that recommended by the examiner, and the reason for the difference is wholly or partly as a result of new evidence, of a new fact, of a different view taken by the authority to a particular fact. Additionally, the authority must consult on those proposals. Annex C to this report sets out the proposed additional recommended officer modifications to the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan to Greenbelt policies. It's important to note that the receipt of this judgment was post-examination of the neighbourhood plan being concluded and the examiner's report, which was issued in February of this year. So consequently, neither the parish or the appointed examiner could take this into consideration in the preparation and examination of the neighbourhood plan. In addition, a challenge to Greenbelt policy in the neighbourhood plan was made by Redrow Homes during the examination phase. Following the publication of the examiner's report for information ahead of a decision made by members, Redrow Homes raised a further challenge and also a threatened judicial review on the basis that they did not consider that the proposed modifications made by the examiner addressed or made clear the decision-making process in relation to York's Greenbelt. Redrow Homes claimed that map 3 in the submitted neighbourhood plan, which shows the draft Greenbelt boundary set out in the fourth set of changes from 2005, and also in conjunction with the wording of policy H14, would unlawfully define the inner Greenbelt boundary, which is the function of the local plan to do that and not the neighbourhood plan. Following advice, it's considered that the proposed additional modifications set out at Annex C would seek to address this challenge and the judgment to secure that the neighbourhood plan meets the basic conditions. Officers have contacted the examiner of the Huntington neighbourhood plan, Andrew Ashcroft, about the recent challenge to the Greenbelt policies, the recent Wedgwood judgment and the proposed modifications. On the basis of the information presented, the examiner confirmed that he's satisfied that it is appropriate for the council to propose to exercise its ability to reach a different decision on elements of his report from February. In terms of next steps, members are asked to recommend to executive to accept Annex C for consultation purposes and to proceed with the consultation on the proposed additional modifications. Subject to this being agreed, officers will proceed with a consultation and bring forward a further report to members in due course to make a decision on the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan Examiner's report and the additional modifications to enable the plan to proceed to referendum. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand back to you.
Chair, if I could just come in just to add to that, I think members will be aware that in terms of referendum, then the government have said there'll be no referendums until May next year. That was announced some time ago. Whether that remains to be the case, I guess only time will tell. So there is work that we can do here to get this in a good position for that stage, and there's time to do a consultation as well. Thank you.
Anna, I did wonder, just as it seems to be sort of the key issue around the main changes, whether it was worth talking through a little bit about pages 76 and 77.
Yes.
Where the specific issues that were raised and what the implications are for that one.
Yeah, let me just get my documents. Yeah, so Annex C basically sets out the key recommended modifications. So there's sort of A to F is our suggested amendments. So firstly, we suggest to amend policy H14 of the plan, which actually is on page 116 of the report. That sets out the policy as it stands. So we are suggesting in terms of policy H14 to explain explicitly that the Greenbelt, the general extent of the Greenbelt has been established by the RSS, by the Regional Spatial Strategy. We also suggest that in policy H14 it should remove the reference to map 3, which is essentially showing the 2005 Greenbelt boundary. And instead reference the RSS or the Regional Spatial Strategy key diagram, which will show the general extent of the Greenbelt, which in Annex C, you can see is map 5. That shows the RSS key diagram. In addition, policy H14, we suggest that to indicate more clearly that the inner boundary of the green belt will be defined through the local plan process, because that's the role of the local plan rather than the neighbourhood plan. D, we suggest that H14 and the supporting text that we state that until the green belt boundaries are defined through the adopted local plan, decisions on whether to treat land as falling within green belt for development management purposes will be taken in accordance with the Wedgwood case from March of this year. So the Wedgwood case essentially said that there's various different documents that will need to be looked at to determine whether the land is green belt or not. So the documents that would need to be considered would be the RSS general extent of the green belt, site-specific features, the 2005 local plan map, and also the emerging local plan as well. And then finally, we suggest that map 3 of the Huntington Neighbourhood Plan removes the 2005 green belt boundary, and I'll just check which map it is.
It's clearest on page sort of 77 to 79.
Yeah, map 3, it basically just takes off the green belt boundary, the 2005 green belt boundary.
Okay.
So those are the key suggested amendments.
Thank you, Anna. Open it up to questions for members. Councillor Cuthbertson, I think that's it. I'm tempted to go to Councillor Crawshaw first because he put his virtual hand up, but you were slightly quicker, so I will go to you first, Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. That's kind. I'll use my virtual hand next time, but I'm happy to yield to Councillor Crawshaw if I can come in after that.
Go ahead, Ian.
Okay. I think my general thoughts on reading the examiner's report and indeed on the neighbourhood plan were that both sets of proposals and modifications proposed by the examiner were, first of all, it was a well thought through plan, and that the examiner had identified the kind of legal loopholes that a neighbourhood plan can often fall into when it defines boundaries or seeks unintentionally to influence planning decisions. But I suppose I ought to ask the question, first of all, I know it's been mentioned somewhere in the document, has the examiner actually seen the proposed changes to the Greenbelt plan and approved them? And I'm sure Mike or Anna could mention that. I think that's my first question. I'll come back later on as other things turn up, if I may, please.
I think probably can answer that. There's been a dialogue with the examiner during the course of the work that has been undertaken.
Yes, the examiner has seen our suggested modifications set out in Annex C, and he agrees with the approach that we're proposing.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. I think probably it's a similar sort of question, really. I just wanted to make sure I've got the right understanding of page 12, paragraph 27, which is subject to members' acceptance of making a decision different to the examiners, and goes on. So broadly speaking, what we're saying is that the examiner made a recommendation. They didn't have information available to them. So we're making a decision which is slightly different than the examiners made because of the new information. We're looking to consult on the specific changes that are relating to the new information, and then we'll take into account all of the other modifications that the examiner has suggested.
That's an excellent summary, Councillor Crawshaw. Thank you.
Great. In which case, I'm happy.
Was there anything else you wanted to bring up, Councillor Cuthbertson?
No, thank you. That amplified my possible next question. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Corwick.
Thank you, Chair. This is such a minor point that I hesitate to make it, but nevertheless, I think it's worth just asking this question. I noticed that the table 4 appearing initially on page 27 and then at page 107 is amended to some degree, but strangely repeats St Andrew's Church and All Saints Church. I'm sure it's just a typo, or maybe there's some other explanation.
Anna, are you able to respond to that
Check
question?
the page number, Chris, because I can't see
Sorry,
that.
which page number was it that you were?
Table 4 on page 27 and then repeated on page 107.
Is that page
107, of course, amends the table 4 of page 27, but nevertheless, there's a repetition of St Andrew's Church and All Saints Church, which seems anomalous. It's a minor point, but I just wonder why that should be the case.
Page 107 of the agenda, Anna.
107.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what was the issue, Chris, with the two? Is the reference to St
Just
Andrew's?
simply the repetition there that St Andrew's Church, All Saints Church appears twice in the list. That's all.
Oh, yeah,
It's
I take your
very
point.
minor.
Oh,
I just
yes.
wonder why.
I think that is probably just a typing error.
I thought that was the case, and as I say, I was
Yeah, it
hesitant to
is.
raise it, but nevertheless, if this is
Yeah,
a public
it
document,
is.
it makes sense to.
Yeah, it
Pick up
is. It is just a typing error, I'm afraid. Yes.
I declare an interest as the one-time vicar of St Andrew's Church, but and if it's repeated, I've no objection to that. But I wondered why that should be the case. Thank you.
That was extremely well spotted, Councillor Cooley. Thank you.
I was going to make the point that was an incredible piece of copywriting type thing, but then realising that you have a particular interest, you may have probably just Control F the document to try and find any references to the church. Councillor Rowley.
Can I declare that I don't have an interest in playing bowls, but New Earswick and District Bowls Club appears twice as well.
Maybe we'll just take away and have a look at that table in general. Anna, before we
Yes,
do
I
it.
will do. Yeah.
The one question I had was around the judicial review from the developer. Seems to be directed at was it directed at the inspector or us? Because they seem to be questioning the work of the inspector, and I was just very intrigued at how you could JR an independent examiner and what precisely the grounds for that would be. Because no decision has been made. The independent examiner has done his job, which is to provide a report and commentary. I just wouldn't have thought that would have been available to JR.
Do you want me, if I may come in there, Chair? The judicial review was threatened against the decision that could be made by members at executive if we went ahead to make a decision on the report and the modifications in the examiner's report. If we didn't make any modifications pertaining to the Greenbelt policies. So it was almost a pre-notification of a judicial review as opposed to against a decision that members may make as opposed to against the examiner's report itself.
Councillor, you're quite right. Obviously, the examiner wasn't making a decision. He was merely putting forward his views and the consideration of the neighbourhood plan as emerging.
It's very uncommon for somebody to threaten JR on something that may or may not happen. I have my own view on those particular issues. But then my second bit was actually sort of an interesting point, because the Wedgwood decision, and I think probably Red Rose position, does seem to make complete sense. And how come the inspector didn't pick it up as part of the process himself?
I think it was maybe because the examiner examined the plan following the submission consultations, which took place over sort of Christmas of last year, and he wrote his report, which he published on the 21st of February of this year. But the Wedgwood case didn't come out until March, so it was he would be unaware, I guess, of the Wedgwood decision, because it wouldn't have been made at the time he published his report.
But even with that Wedgwood, I would have thought applying the map as it is from the draft local plan that is existing would have made more sense than the 2005 map anyway. It still wouldn't have been right, but if I'd have been looking at that, I would have been saying, why are you using the 2005 map and not the 2018 map? That's it for inspection.
If I think the decision was taken, Chair, that that was the represented position with an approved decision by members to go forward with, whereas the work in terms of the local plan is still emerging through the examination process, and there's been no decision on that as yet. So I think the examiner, took that decision, and the same decision has been taken with some of the previously made plans as well that are now in force, in terms of showing the 2005 boundary, because it was an approved decision by members in 2005 as a representative boundary.
Thanks, Isaac. Do I have anybody else any questions or comments on this particular item? I think I'll just reiterate the officers' thanks to the members of the Parish Council of Huntington who've put the work in to get this through. We will, until the local plan is adopted, we will still get this strangely anomalous position where neighbourhood plans which were designed to follow the local plan and provide a little bit more detail on areas from the local plan are coming forward prior to the local plan being in a sense, and while ever they're subservient to it, it's always going to be slightly problematic, and we'll have issues like this. So I think that we have the recommendations at the top of page 6. Are members happy to approve those recommendations? That's all those. Anybody not in favour? I think it's probably the quickest way. Okay, so we'll take that on, and then that will go through to the executive, Mike, won't it, for formal approval?
It will indeed. Thank you. Thank you, members.
So the next item on the agenda is item 5, which is the temporary amendments to the council statement of community involvement. Did you want to speak to Francis, or did you want to introduce Mike?
I think no, Francis is going to come straight in here on this. Thank you.
Sure. So this item relates to the council's adopted statement of community involvement, or SCI, which sets out how the community will be involved in planning documents and planning applications, and it ensures that the community are involved as much as possible. Earlier this year, the government, through the National Planning Practice Guidance, encouraged local authorities to review their SCIs in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic to reflect the social distancing restrictions that are in place. So officers have undertaken such a review. The outcomes are presented at Annex A to the committee reports, highlighting the consultation measures that we suggest perhaps need to be temporarily suspended. The obvious ones would be face-to-face meetings, and also the availability of hard copies of documents, both in West offices and in libraries. There's also a number of changes in relation to planning applications, which have already been publicised on the council's website through the service updates. It's proposed that Annex A is put on the website to sit alongside the SCI as a sort of covering note, and made very clear that the measures are only temporary, to be lifted as and when we're able to get back to normal. Also, as set out at paragraph 5 of committee report, that we're undertaking a full review of the SCI to make sure that it's fully fit for purpose and up to date. For example, to include social media as a consultation method, which is currently missing, and that's going to be reported to members in due course. So as set out at paragraph 3, we're asking members to recommend to executive 3 things: to agree the temporary revisions to the SCI as set out in Annex A, to authorise officers to publish the covering note on the council's website, and then to agree to delegate authority to when the decision is made to lift the temporarily suspended methods when we're able to include them again. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Francis. I've got Councillor Rowley, who's very quick off the mark.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for letting me be part of your team this afternoon. It's just a simple question, really, and it's a general concern I have whenever we look to suspend the norm for a temporary period. And whilst I understand the officer's comments that it's going to be temporarily suspended until such times as we're able to go back to the norm, I just have a slight fear about not putting a review date in there. So whether it could be suspended with a review at a particular point, that would be my only thought, Chair.
I don't know if you want to come back on that one, Mike or Francis. I think it's something that I pondered myself. It feels a bit open-ended.
it's quite hard to know. There may be some measures that we could bring back in sooner than others. It's really hard to put a date on. I don't know whether Francis or Alison have a view on that. We're happy to. Clearly, we want to review it. We want to bring in the measures that we had previously as soon as we can.
I think that's just what the National Planning Practice Guidance suggests, is that to bring them back in as soon as is possible. It doesn't give any sort of indication, obviously, when that might be.
I think Councillor Crawshaw wanted to come in on the specific point, then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was actually going to make a similar point to Councillor Rowley, and I was going to propose a amended wording for recommendation 3. So if I can formally move a change in wording. So what we would suggest is to insert, so it would read, agree to delegate authority for a period of up to 6 months to the corporate director, and then add at the end of the paragraph there, if after a period of 6 months the arrangements as shown in Annex A remain in place, the local plan working group be asked to reconfirm a further period of suspension.
Okay, thank you.
I'd be happy to second that, Johnny. Councillor Malley.
Yeah, I had my hand up to second that as well. I agree with Councillor Rowley's comments and Councillor Crawshaw's comments. Paragraph 8 on page 135 just says for the duration of the pandemic, which is so vague. I don't know how you define when the pandemic ends. And these changes do represent quite a bit of rollback in democratic engagement, which is a serious matter. I understand why it's necessary, but it is a serious matter. I don't think as a committee it's right to agree to these changes just indefinitely. I think it does need to come back for renewal, for reapproval. 6 months seems like quite a sensible time period for that to me.
Councillor Rowley, I know you were indicating you wanted to come back on your original.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. No, all it was really was just to, Mike had indicated that I was suggesting that we do it kind of piecemeal, bit by bit, and it wasn't. It was just that we review the decisions that are taken at a regular time. So it was just that.
That's absolutely fine. That can go as your, if you, well, you put that to the vote, I guess, in a minute.
The one thing I'd want to check on, Mike, is as it goes to executive, if this is approved, which I'm sure it will be, is that we don't inadvertently do it the wrong way, so that you can't bring back something sooner because you're tied to a decision that limits it to 6 months, and just make sure we've got the flexibility.
I guess it's no later than that. Clearly, as you've said, Chair, yeah, if we can bring it back earlier, then, you know, that's good and well, we'll do that.
So we don't tie it as a whole block. So if you get a point to say, well, actually, we can start having hard copies in West offices, but we're not allowed to do that now because the decision means that we have to roll back everything simultaneously. Just Councillor Melly.
Yeah, I think what Councillor Crawshaw proposed, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what I heard was that if the decision isn't reversed within 6 months, then it has to come back to a committee. It doesn't remove the ability for a delegated decision to be made to reverse these temporary changes.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to raise a separate point, but I do support the comments just raised there. Should I wait for this little conversation to pass, or should I make my separate point now?
Well, I'll take a show of hands if everyone is happy to accept the amendment that Councillor Crawshaw has proposed. Appears to be unanimous, so I think we can take that as being read now. So I think we'll take that. So if you want to move on, Councillor Taylor, feel free.
Magic. Thanks, Chair. I just want to say that I obviously get the need for, if you like, a temporary change given the times we're in, but I'm not convinced that we're still doing everything that we can. I do have a concern that people who are both socially isolated and digitally inactive, or however you want to phrase that, will be marginalised by what we're saying. And that, can we have a conversation about that as a committee? I mean, thinking out loud here, and given how infrequent it would be needed to take place, I would like the council to at least offer certain people the chance to have documentation posted out to them if they really don't have anyone they can ask. I mean, I think the idea that we'll ask residents to ask a friend or family member or however it's worded in the paper, it just, for me, it's a bit embarrassing. I think we can do more than that, you know, in the year 2020. So yeah, that's just the point of concern. I wonder what other members think, really. I think we can post stuff out and maybe look at having stuff in libraries on a controlled basis, because we can't be leaving people out of the process no matter whether or not we're in a pandemic.
I had flagged that myself, Councillor Taylor, and I'll be honest, the library issue, I was going to raise that question myself, because while I see that we shouldn't necessarily at the moment be encouraging mass travel to West offices, our libraries are open, so I wasn't entirely sure why we couldn't still be making hard copies available at the libraries. Was that?
Okay, I think we can pick up both of those. Certainly, both Becky Eads and myself have been open to any representations from individuals or on behalf of individuals have problem getting hold of information. Certainly for some planning applications, it could be that key drawings or key diagrams or information could be sent out rather than just everything. Perhaps some are quite large in terms of the volumes of material, but happy to pick up both those points between now and exec so that we can have that debate perhaps as well with exec on Thursday.
And it's worth saying, Mike, as well, it's sometimes slightly more complicated. So my initial view being it's not always easy to see planning documents on a computer, but then we refer to people who are digitally excluded, that there are scales towards that. So there could be people who do technically have access to the internet, but that's through their phone, and trying to go through a really complicated planning application on a 2-inch screen is not entirely something that you're able to do. So just because people do have access, and it may be a small tablet, it may be something else that they have it, but actually being able to physically go through some very complicated planning drawings is quite a challenge. Councillor Norman.
Yeah, cheers. Partially just to sort of back up that point, really, I think it's really important that we tackle digital exclusion as best we can. And I would note that certainly when it's come to the sort of process for informing residents and collecting views with regards to traffic measures has involved more of sending out information to people than it previously would have done it in a physical format. So it's not exactly without precedent at present too. And also just to further flag, because I do think increasingly we are going to be, the government's clearly signalling that it wants more and more of its planning framework and consultation framework to be digitized. I think it's really important that if we are using other kinds of measures for face-to-face meetings, public exhibitions, etc., that we have sort of firm wording about that. And I think the current sort of bit in the document about the council seeking to engage virtually using social sort of software platforms is maybe a little loose, potentially could be tightened up into a more firm commitment rather than the word seek.
Okay, thank you. Just to reiterate comments that Francis made earlier, this is some temporary amendments potentially to our statement of community involvement, but we've recognised we need to do a refresh anyway. So some of the points, such as Councillor Norman's just made, we can build into our refresh as well. And the other thing, I think members have made reference to some of the planning reforms. We wait with interest what the outcome of that is, because our representations, I think, as a planning authority to government are that we still think that there is a need for providing information as we do by writing to individuals, by emailing people and having site notices. And we're unconvinced professionally, I think, as to how many people will find out about what's going on in the area if we were to stop those ways of publicising planning applications. Thank you.
Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I appreciated seeing the proposal to extend the consultation period from 21 days to 28 days, because as has just been said, people are out and about less likely to notice the notices, and less likely to just be talking to their friends and neighbours as before. People are just generally a bit more isolated. Yeah, I couldn't really see enough justification in the report for the suspension of having paper copies available in the library. I know we've already discussed it, but I do think that, as I already said, we are talking about reducing democratic engagement. I would just like to see more justification for it, so that we know that this decision is justified. And if it really, we've talked about digital exclusion. Usually the council is quite good at providing digital support in West offices. In the visitor centre, there are computers, there's people on hand to help. Seeing as that extra digital support isn't available at the moment, it's even more important that the non-digital availability is there. So I would like to second Councillor Taylor's proposal that that plans can be sent to people by post on request.
I don't know if Francis wants to come in on that in terms of some of the guidance that's emerged from MHCLG and government generally.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder maybe about the libraries, we could firm up the wording to talk about, I think the reason why that was put in was to do with restrictions at opening hours. I think when I first started looking at it, perhaps we could just put a link to the library opening hours and just maybe say that people need to be aware that they're not as open as they were, if that's still the case, or that they might be changing as the pandemic changes, rather than saying that we're not going to have them in the libraries. And I mean, also for the same for West offices, if they are open, then there's no reason why we can't have them in there.
Councillor Douglas, I have noticed you.
Sorry, is that my invitation to speak? Thank you for that, Chair. I just wanted to say that I am a little bit concerned about the statement that this can be done in the refresh, which goodness knows when that might be. And I think that it's important that we get this sorted out for what's going to happen in the immediate period between now and when that refresh happens, and not, as Councillor Melly's already said, that we create a democratic deficit. So I think it's important that we do decide upon what we're going to do today rather than leave it.
Sorry, I wasn't meaning to say that these things weren't important. We shouldn't address them today, Councillor Douglas. I think there are some things generally, though, on the wider review of the document and the engagement and use of social media that I think we can look at further in more detail. But we need to address these immediate things and build in sort of flexibility to get back to some of the normal ways that we have, perhaps, for communication and encouraging people to participate.
Councillor Melly.
Thanks for calling me on me yet again, Chair. Paragraph 12 on page 136 states that officers will be able to discuss planning matters by telephone. Now, I'm just wondering, I know that these are kind of proposed changes, but realistically, this is kind of how the council's been operating for the past 6 or 7 months. So do we have evidence from the previous few months of how effectively and how available council officers are to answer planning questions on the phone? Just anecdotally, had quite a few residents approach me now on saying that they've tried to get through to the council, they've called multiple times, they've had callbacks, and they haven't been able to get answers to their questions about planning applications on the phone. That's why they've ended up approaching the local councillors to ask questions about planning applications, because that system hasn't been working. Just wondering if we've got any...
Melly, I'm happy to pick that up outside the meetings. I need to check. Certainly when we went down into lockdown, then people were using all sorts of kit and they didn't have access to systems, in some cases, other than using their own phones. So I think measures are in place now to be able to, for people to be able to speak to them directly, but I will check with you as to where that is and whether that's everyone. People are still working from home and people have got all sorts of issues. Some people have just broadband issues from where they work, for example, or don't have landlines.
I'll talk to you outside the meeting about specific examples, but no, some of them was just last week. A resident was trying to get through to the council on a new planning application that's just gone in. So this was recent. I think she said she tried 3 times to call the council to get. She had specific answers about amendments to a planning application and couldn't get any answer over the phone. I mean, it might be a one-off, or I'm hoping, seeing as this has been the situation for 6 months, there is some evidence to to suggest and explain how this proposed new system will work, and some reassurances for us that these proposed changes can be effective.
Okay, I don't have the details to be able to answer that, or the evidence to be able to say just where we are on that, but I do know there were technical problems and difficulties in contacting people other than through email. Home working wasn't geared up for people to be able to speak to people on the phone on their own. But I think now we have some cheap and affordable mobile phones that have been distributed to planning officers so that those numbers can be used, I think, from them working from home.
This report does go from here to executive, Mike, so there's the opportunity to provide a little update on that and provide some level of information to the executive when it goes there about that.
Happy to do that, Chair.
Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair, and apologies for waving around. My laptop lags a bit, so my blue hand's a bit slow. I'd like to ask if, I mean, I appreciate officers giving this the time of day, but I'd like to pin this down a bit more if possible before we close the discussion. And I'd like to see if, could we put a vote to the members of this committee to see if we could add an additional stipulation that in this temporary circumstance, the council is happy to post hard copy documentation in certain circumstances and use third-party sites where safe and appropriate, such as libraries or perhaps post offices. And then whatever goes in front of the executive will be much clearer. And it'd be great if the committee could back that. I mean, I know it's temporary, but I think the fact that it is temporary means that we should be making more of an effort to bridge those gaps rather than sort of shuffle back. Yeah, that's my only ask, and it's to try and move this conversation on a bit. I hope you don't mind.
I'm going to do completely opposite, Councillor Taylor, unfortunately, because I was going to take a vote at the end, but I'm conscious I've got quite a few points, and there may be other things that people flag up before we actually say which particular, whether we get the whole lot in before we do it. Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, I guess it's just trying to understand a bit what that might mean, because some planning applications could be sort of thousands and thousands of paper, and maps and all the rest of it. So perhaps if the resolution was for planning to go away and think about how we might best do that, and then bring that to executive, rather than committing them to posting thousands of pages.
I take your point. I've seen some very lengthy ones. Does anybody else have anything before I throw my 10 bob in? Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. I broadly support Councillor Taylor's suggestion. My only slight hesitation would be there was the word with certain circumstances. Whenever you begin to legislate and use the word circumstances, you've got to then list what those circumstances are. So I welcome and support Councillor Taylor's suggestion, but with some more clarity.
Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Rowley. I totally get what you mean. I mean, I guess it would be extremely difficult for the council to have a perfectly efficient system on this question, but in my mind, it would be almost the case of the resident rings the council planning team, and they are then asked a series of questions. Do you have access to the internet? Do you know someone who has access to the internet who you feel comfortable liaising with? Are you able to visit a third-party site such as a library or post office? And if the answer to those three questions was no, then you have a sort of clearish picture that they might well need some assistance via postage. But, you might well get people out there that might want to take advantage of that. But I think, in the grand scheme of things, it's the right thing to do. And the exceptional cases shouldn't drive that not happening. But that'd be the only thing I'd say. But I'd trust officers to come up with something a bit tighter than that.
I think that would probably have been my suggestion, was that the best way to do it would be for the committee to voice its concerns to executive, to then give us time to draft something that might work. Because I think sentiment is yes, Councillor Taylor, exactly what you're saying we want to do, but it's just how make sure we get the wording right. And as I often find, trying to do wording by committee is not always the greatest thing to achieve. But on that point, I'll go through the points that I had, Mike. So paragraph 12 has already been mentioned by two of the members. I equally had that concern of there will be people that don't have friends and family that they can use in terms of submitting applications. So I did wonder, I've just written the word proxy down. I'm not really sure what I was thinking about that, hence why I hadn't drafted any recommendations, but whether there's a system we can put in place for those people who don't have friends and family that can submit digitally on their behalf. We've mentioned the things about the libraries. At the bottom of page 142, there was the issue around people asking other people to send in comments for a planning application. Seeing that from the other end, from a planning committee, I have some concerns about how that would be represented when it came to any report to a planning committee, because it would seem anomalous, for example, if they've got a relative in Milton Keynes to send in an objection to something happening at their mother's house in York next door. From a planning committee perspective, you may be looking at that and thinking, well, why is this person in Milton Keynes so concerned about that? So making sure that where people have submitted comments on behalf of somebody else, it's clear that it is actually related to the property that it's at.
Absolutely.
And page 143, despite the fact that we say throughout that people can call if they need to call, we don't actually have the telephone number on that particular paragraph. So,
okay, we'll pick those up.
Democratic services, but it doesn't say if you can't access by dial the following number.
In terms of the paper copies, I understand all the points we made and agree with and understand members' concerns on that. It's just trying to think about different ways to do that. You know, are there any other venues in a locality perhaps where papers could be available? I think somebody mentioned post offices, but depending where you are, you know, if it's one of the rural parishes, is there a village hall? Is there somewhere you can get access to that? I think what we will have to clearly try and avoid is what we could just be overwhelmed with requests for printing. That I don't think the council either has the capacity within the print room or the budget for that. And again, as some members have pointed out, some applications out of necessity are extremely lengthy in terms of the amount of documentation. So we will a bit of time, thank you, to think about how we can respond to that before the Executive Council.
And just off the top of my head, it's just come to me, for those that have them, where there are parish councils tend to have planning subcommittees who actually, like for Hughes without parish council, they do, unfortunately not, because we haven't got public meetings, but they do actually project the planning applications in that ward, in that parish, onto the screen, and it's a public meeting that people can go and actually see that. We have got local planning panels in places that aren't parishes, so there may be a possibility to use those, and those individuals already have the technology to display planning applications and such like, and we'll be looking at them anyway to perhaps signpost people to there. Councillor Fisher, I was just about to wind it up.
Thank you. Yeah, I take your point about parish councils. Parish council offices, as we have in Strensall, are shut. That's the problem. And of course, if somebody is digitally unable to access a meeting, all parish council subcommittee meetings now for planning are held online. So it doesn't really help them. The difficulty is, where on earth can we put them? Look, we're lucky in Strensall, we've got a library, but there are other, and that's not open very often at the moment, but it is open. But there are other parishes which may be, you know, have much more difficulty. Stockton-on-the-Forest, for example, there is no way you could put a planning application for people to see.
Councillor Melly, is that?
Just wanted to just confirm these proposed changes, they're just changes to the statutory minimum required. It's not saying that other forms of consultation or ways of displaying plans won't be allowed, or will need there won't have to be some sort of decision made either by officers or exec to remove these temporary changes in order to do more than the statutory minimum. So everything we're talking about is completely possible without a long kind of bureaucratic process to implement them. If somebody finds that they're able to do it, they can go ahead and do it, right?
That's the case, but I think at the end of the day, this should be setting out our position as an authority for how we're going to deal with public involvement and public consultation on a whole range of planning matters, and hence the need also for a refresh that the original document didn't recognise the use of social media to be able to give publicity to proposals, I guess. I'll bring Francis in here perhaps, or Alison.
Yes, so our understanding is that this is the changes to the minimum standards. We can go over and above this if we were able to at short notice, and that's part of potentially the delegated decision in terms of removing the temporary suspensions, or our ability to consult wider using the methods that we have available to us under the current restrictions.
And of course, if we found that the measures just weren't working and there were large sections of the community that weren't getting involved that wanted to, we could also look at changing the alternative methods whilst we can't do our standard methods.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I think the point is it won't be large sections of the community that can't access, but that's why it needs to be raised. And I do want to just say one last thing, and I do not disregard the logistical and, if you like, capacity challenges that this poses, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and do it, and it is temporary. And it's important that nobody is shut out of democratic participation, even in a pandemic. And it will be an absolute nightmare at times to manage this type of thing, but it would look brilliant if we can say that we're still doing it because it's the right thing to do. And that's all I'll say. I've gone on enough. Thank you.
Councillor Taylor, we share that sentiment. We want people to be fully engaged and not excluded because of the unfortunate circumstances that we're all in at the moment.
So my suggestion is, and I'm not sure if this is going to please anybody or nobody or everybody, is that we take the recommendations as written as amended with Councillor Crawshaw's suggestions, and then add in an additional recommendation that notes the concerns that were raised by the committee in terms of those who may be excluded from participating, and request officers to provide an update to executive on measures that can be taken to address those concerns.
Yep. That's fine. Understood.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, that amendment's fine, but I would like a specific thing added to that to say, such as looking at hard copy distribution where necessary. That's all. I was assuming that the note would include all of the comments that were raised. I'm hoping that our minute takers got them all recorded. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go back and watch the whole thing. But the idea was to list all the concerns. That's why I said the concerns raised. So you can list all those and then specifically answer each one in turn. Well, and I would assume that too. But the fact that this paper is the way it currently is right now means that I'm not willing to make that assumption. I think we need to be extra explicit because it's not in the paper at the moment.
Councillor Melly.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I was going to say more or less the same things. I'm not comfortable with approving the recommendations as they are because it includes things like paper copies availability at libraries is temporarily suspended, and that's something that I feel as a committee we agreed shouldn't be. Like we appreciate that paper copies may be less available at libraries due to reduced opening times, but I don't think as a committee we've agreed to recommend that paper copies will be suspended. For example.
I had envisaged that would be picked up as part of the document, part of the addendum that we're going to send through. Was my intention. It wasn't to ignore that, because I say that's. But that response to digital exclusion would be around paper copies at libraries, paper copies at village halls. That's what I'd envisaged that to be. My concern is if we try and get everything down, we'll miss something at this point. And then,
Chair, sorry, we've picked up the need for flexibility. We've picked up the need to get back to the normal wherever we can, as quickly as we can. And we've picked up that in terms of libraries and other venues, we need some sort of flexibility and to be able to point out to people perhaps that whilst there may be copies of things in locations, they may need to be aware that the normal sort of opening hours may vary from what they would perhaps have expected some months ago.
In terms of moving it forward, it's just occurred to me that Councillor Taylor is, I believe, the vice chair of this committee. So if we amend my amended amendment to say that document that goes through to executive with recommendations is approved by chair and vice chair, then Callum, you'll have the chance to ensure that anything that you wanted in there is in there. Because it's not an attempt to keep it out. It's just, I don't want to try and sit here and try and list all the sort of things that we've tried to mention and miss some stuff out. So if we just say, if we delegate that to chair and vice chair to approve, and then you can put in through that process the reference to hard copies and anything else you might think of between now and the report, though Mike's going to kill me because he hasn't got that long to write it. Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. I was going to offer a potential second slight workaround as well, just on recommendation 1. If we change the first couple of words, so instead of asking or recommending executive agree the recommended temporary revisions, if we ask them to consider the updated temporary revisions, and then it's just making it clear that what's at Annex A currently, we're expecting to have some revisions to, based on the discussion that we've had today and the additional recommendation that you've suggested already.
I'll propose it to try and keep it simple. Happy to accept that what you've just said there, Councillor Crawshaw, slight change to the wording at the beginning of recommendation 1. The already approved amendment that was suggested at the beginning, and an additional recommendation providing an update on how we will deal with those who are digitally excluded to be approved by chair and vice chair before being sent on to the executive with a report. Anyone happy to second that? Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Can I have a show of hands for all those in favour? That's universal. Thank you. That's one very constructive debate. So it takes us on to the final item on the agenda, which is item 6, which is the update on the York local plan. And I'll hand over to you again, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. I'm going to start on this and then bring Alison in. So very briefly, and the report gives some background. There's some key milestones in there in the background. As you remember, the draft local plan was submitted for examination back in May 2018. A lot happened between then, and a lot of work to be able to get us to what was the first phase of the hearing sessions for the examination of the plan by the 2 appointed planning inspectors, and that was last December at the racecourse. That first phase was all about considering basically the soundness of the plan and legal compliance. It's those high level issues that concern the inspectors that they need to have ticks in boxes before they then move on to a lot of the details which are contained within any local plan. Again, as you'll remember and is identified in the report, the inspectors identified there were certain areas where they wanted more work to be undertaken by the authority, or in response to the discussions that had taken place back before last Christmas. There were questions that were raised by some of the participants or clarifications that emerged from that. And in the report, paragraph 18 on pages 149 to 150 sets out some of those key areas of what we've affectionately called sort of local plan homework. That's not a planning term. That's just what we had to do. And if we can come on to those perhaps in more detail in a minute. There's a summary there of the things that we had to cover, and all of these things where they've been addressed are all on the council's or the examination web page, and all the references are in the documents that you've got before you today. In terms of the outstanding bits we've got to do, and these have taken longer than we expected really. One is, and I'll bring Alison in here because this is really quite technical and legal really, but the habitat regulations assessment work that has been associated with looking at the site, the Strensall Common site, and protecting that is almost there, I think, now, but not quite. The work on the green belt that the inspectors asked us to do, we clarified one of the issues was about how far York's Greenbelt goes from the centre of York. And the representations made at the examination by at least one party saying it was basically a circle that was only 6 miles from the centre of York, and there was a debate as to about whether that was from the Minster or St Helens Square, etc., etc. We've answered some of those Greenbelt issues, but there were some of the issues in terms of the Greenbelt methodology for the boundaries around the urban core of the city and around the villages that the inspectors hadn't we hadn't sold it to them in terms of how we'd done that work, and they wrote to us, as you remember, and there's reference in here, expressing their concern about that. We looked carefully at that, and we feel that, or we felt that, having taken both planning and legal advice, that we needed to do more work on that to satisfy the inspectors that the whole approach was a sound approach, and that we were effectively good to go at this first phase on the general principles of our approach to Greenbelt, and we could move into phase 2. There's been quite a lot of work to do on that, using external help, internal help, particularly that, and just to remind people, the reason really why York's got a Greenbelt is to protect the historic character and setting of the city, and it's one of the few Greenbelts that has that purpose. So the work that we've done with English Heritage, Historic England, over a number of years, informed very much of that process. And we've got documentation of the work that's been done, but we perhaps hadn't articulated that as well as we ought to have done with hindsight into the Greenbelt paper. In addition to these things, then again, it's in the report. And one of the problems with York getting a local plan is that things are always changing. So back in July of this year, the Office of National Statistics produced some new household population, household formation projections, and the inspectors have asked to comment on those. We've commissioned some work from GL Hearn, who've been advising us on these matters, as well as a number of other authorities. So we've been dealing with that as well, and Alison can update on those aspects perhaps. I don't know, the Chair, whether you want to pause there, or whether perhaps Alison's update on the Greenbelt, the HRA, and the housing and population projections, whether you want to take that.
I think we'll just go straight into Alison and then take questions.
Thank you, Alison.
Okay, thank you. So in relation to the habitat regulation assessment, we did produce an updated habitat regulation assessment last year. And unfortunately, at the examination hearing, it was identified that part of the report that we had submitted wasn't quite laid out right in terms of some of the case law. So the case law changed to say that if there was any identified impacts against one of the nature conservation sites in question, all of that analysis had to be done in the second part of the report in detail under a process called appropriate assessment. Looking at that report, we agreed at the examination that we would update the report and take into account some extra information that was new to us and provided to us that the inspectors was keen for us to look at. That information was in relation to Strensall Common special area of conservation, that is a heathland area right adjacent to Strensall village. That particular parcel of land has been contentious in terms of how we've looked at it and the evidence base supporting it. So originally, when we submitted the plan, we included the allocation, as you'll be aware, for a Queen Elizabeth Barracks in Strensall for 500 homes. Since then, and as a result of the habitat regulation assessment last year, we proposed to remove that site from the local plan on the basis that we couldn't rule out that development in that location would not have adverse effects on the common. And the new information that the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, the landowners for the Queen Queen Elizabeth Barracks submitted to us before Christmas was crucial in our understanding of whether or not that situation had changed and whether or not there were further mitigation that we should look at in terms of whether or not that allocation should be incorporated into the plan or not. That work has been ongoing with our consultants this year, and we've recently concluded that, and we've had Natural England look at the outcomes as our statutory body to advise us on the outcomes and the conclusions that we have reached. We have now concluded that report, and there are some further amendments that we would like to suggest to policy. Natural England have come back to us in terms of their response now, and I hope to be publishing that report fairly shortly, subject to sign off under delegated authority that we have in place at the moment for that. But the report, positively, Natural England do support our view and the outcomes of that report now. So all of that will be, like I say, when we've had that signed off, submitted to the inspectors for their information. And we will be commencing discussions with any interested parties and landowners that are involved in some of the outcomes of that report in our future discussions, and hopefully setting out some more statements of common ground that the inspectors can refer to in later phases of the hearing sessions. As Mike said, we had a letter from the inspectors in June setting out some of, in terms of first phase hearings. I won't go over all of, because obviously Mike set out that in summary, but just to say that presented both positive outcomes and their concerns. So as Mike said, they positively responded to the work that we'd already submitted in terms of looking at the outer boundary and designated the outer boundary, the location of the outer boundary of the green belt, and they also confirmed to us that we're not establishing any new green belt. We are just defining the boundaries for the first time. We're seeking to set the greenbelt boundaries around our needs, as opposed to demonstrating exceptional circumstances, which is a process where you have to take out sites. We took the precautionary approach previously, where we demonstrated exceptional circumstances, and they've said we don't need to do that. They also, as Mike said, confirmed to us that they accept the primary purpose of our greenbelt is purpose 4 to preserve the historic care and setting of York. That in terms of looking at that, we're looking at the different evidence bases, and we think that we've responded to the inspectors in an initial letter to say that our review of that so far has found that we think the boundaries that we've identified are right, but we accept that we could present more simply and declare simply the information that we the methodology that we have used, and also to clarify some of their misunderstandings that they set out in their letter around the evidence base and the approach that we have taken. And that's going to be really important, and that's something that officers are currently working on and progressing at the moment, and we hope that something will go back to the inspectors hopefully next month in response to that. In terms of the inspector's letter of July and the 2018 based household projections, we were asked by the inspectors to clarify whether or not there was a meaningful change in relation to the work that we'd submitted last year and discussed at examination, and that was that we proposed an amendment last year to our submitted plan. So our submitted plan, you had presented at 867 dwellings per annum as the housing need figure. Last year's data was based upon the 2016 base household projections, and came out with a figure of 790 dwellings per annum. That we consulted on that across June and July last year, and it was discussed in detail at the hearing sessions in December. As Mike said, this new work commissioned by J.O. Hearn continues to look at the same methodology that we looked at last year, and against some updated evidence, and that continues to support the figure of 790 dwellings per annum as a housing need, as a starting point for housing need in York. And that's based upon an economic-led figure, which means that as you go through the process of the methodology, there's an uplift added to the baseline figure that is proposed in the projections to make sure we meet our economic aspirations. And our economic aspirations, as set out in the plan, is for 650 jobs per annum. So that 790 figure meets those aspirations. we have actually received, since the report was published last week, we have actually received a response from our inspectors on that evidence base in the letter we submitted to them, referring to this and our response to it. And our response said that we accepted the outcomes of the GR Hearn housing need update report, and that we were going to continue to support a housing need of 790 dwellings per annum and an overall housing requirement of 822 dwellings per annum, which incorporates a shortfall of housing between 2012 and 2017. And as part of the inspector's letter back to us, they've acknowledged receipt of that. They've set out to us that the evidence, it now forms part of a key evidence of the local plan as part of the examination. And they also identify that any work that we submit as part of the Greenbelt addendum update will similarly be key documents in the examination. As part of that, they've identified to us that we will need to consult on all of these documents before the examination can proceed, and they do think it's necessary that we will need to have a hearing session to discuss those outcomes in due course when available to do so. They have recognised that at the moment, face-to-face hearing sessions are not generally taking place, and they've sent us some guidance in relation to how hearing sessions may take place virtually and to set out how the council might start thinking about how that might proceed. We are aware of other virtual hearing sessions going on at the moment with other local plans in their examination, and it is in a similar format to this. It's generally in a Zoom meeting, or it's in a MS Teams meeting, Microsoft Teams meeting, and so that's something we need to explore and go back to the inspectors on. But we intend to respond to the inspectors with the Greenbelt work as soon as possible on that. And like I say, with the habitat regulation assessment, I'm sure they'll keep updating us with further correspondence when they see the need to do so. Just to say as well that the inspectors have made clear in their update to us and in their letter that whilst they've asked the council to respond on this matter, they have made it clear that now we have responded to this matter. Any comments on the contents of our response and on the evidence base we've submitted should be held until we consult on the matters in public. And they're not. They're going. And our programme officer has confirmed that she's returning correspondence to anybody that will be submitting comments in relation to that prior to our consultation taking place. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Alison. Members, just to say, in terms of the consultation, we haven't got the details from the inspector. We've had a sort of an indication that they think we need to reconsult on our homework. We envisage that's probably a consultation of those people who are participants at the stage one and who made representations. So we don't think this is, a whole city consultation, but it is more focused, giving people an opportunity to make further comments in addition to those they made last December. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Councillor Taylor, I'm aware, has had his virtual hand up for so long he must be virtually exhausted. So I'll go first to Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I only put it up because my laptop's so awful. It might not work when I want it to. I just before we get into this discussion, and forgive me, Chair, if we've already done this in a previous meeting. I don't think we have. I wondered if we could note our thanks and again condolences to Rachel Macefield, the council officer who passed away and worked so much and so hard on the local plan. Is that something we can do, at least in the minutes, just to acknowledge how much work she did? Would members support that? I know that's quite heavy, but I think it's probably appropriate and the right thing to do.
100% support that, Councillor Taylor, and we'll make sure that definitely goes into the minutes. Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Alison and Mike, for the presentation, the report on this update. Can I just refer to page 152, please, of the report, which seems to set out a number of arguments around this issue of methodology. Paragraph 25 seems quite optimistic that the greenbelt boundaries that we've planned, that we've presented, should remain intact. However, is this just a debate about methodology, or is it really something more crucial than that? Could the methodology debate lead to changes in the greenbelt boundaries, certainly around Southwest York, where I've clearly got a ward interest? Please.
Is that okay, Mike?
Yeah, go on. So yeah.
We think that there's been, as Mike sort of alluded to, we think that the almost the answer we have got to is the correct answer, but we haven't articulated it in the most simple and straightforward way. So what the principal concern from the inspectors in relation to the greenbelt, and it is to do with the methodology, Councillor Carr, principally, in this is the sense that they think that we have conflated. So we've looked at a two-tier approach to the greenbelt. So we've looked at sort of strategic understanding, which is looking at sort of the broad city and understanding the wider concept of greenbelt in context, as well as local level considerations where we've looked at detailed evidence in, and that's the basis on which we've based our detailed decisions on the location of the greenbelt, and look in considering openness and permanence. The inspectors in their letter have detailed to us that they think that we have conflated the issues that we've looked at from the spatial strategy in the local plan, which sets out our principle of location of development, with the greenbelt methodology and how we have then defined the greenbelt boundary. That's one of the key things that we're looking at clarifying for the inspectors, to say that we understand that the presentation of this isn't straightforward, and this is, we're seeking to clarify that for them. As I said previously, in terms of the way that we've looked at and define the boundaries, we think that we can justify the boundaries on the basis of where they are at the moment. We think there'll be very limited changes in accordance with when we review the methodology, and when we review that against the boundaries that we've identified, we think there'll be very limited changes. The changes that are likely to be seen, if there are any changes, are reflective of the clarifications the inspector has given to us in relation to looking at changing away from exceptional circumstances to identifying the need around boundaries, and really just reflecting their comments that they've already in the approach that they've confirmed.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think we've used the greenbelt methodology, we believe, appropriately, but what we then looked at were the shapers and the constraints and the opportunities to decide where we do need greenfield sites, which sites perhaps could come forward within the green belt. And clearly we know, other than the historic character and setting, there are other constraints. We've got green wedges, we've got strays, we've got floodplains. We've got all those factors then that have informed the consideration of a relatively small number of sites that have come forward for greenfield sites for development in the local plan. And just to remind members, pretty much all of the land that adjoins the urban boundaries of the city was the subject of people putting forward sites for development. So there has been a sieving process effectively, which has ruled out many hundreds of sites adjacent to and next to the urban area. Councillor Carr, we'd always envisaged that we were going to have a debate on many of these sites through the examination process because of the land interests that will come forward, and people will try and persuade the inspectors that we've got the boundaries wrong in the case of their particular land ownership, that their field for some reason should be part of the urban area and not a green field. So we hadn't envisaged that we would get to this level of consideration so early in the local plan examination process, but we need to do a little bit more work just to go back a stage to show, as Alison has explained, that we have followed a greenbelt methodology in terms of defining the greenbelt. And what is quite clear, and I find quite interesting, is the inspectors have accepted from the evidence they've got so far, that we have a green belt, and that green belt can go right up to the administrative boundaries of the city, adjoining, in some cases, green belt that goes into the neighbouring districts. But we haven't had to go through every field or every parcel of land in that wider rural geography to demonstrate that that has a green belt function. But it feels like we almost have been asked to do that at this stage, and hence we think we need to represent our work in a way that's clearer and is supported by our conversations with Historic England colleagues. Hope that helped. It was a long answer, sorry.
Councillor Crawshaw, I've got Councillor Carr wanting to come back.
I did.
Is yours a separate point? And then I'll take Councillor Carr's first and then come to you. Yeah.
It was a supplementary question, actually, Chair. It was about whether all this grand work could be derailed by the planning white paper.
Yes, in terms of the planning white paper, it's out to consultation. The consultation, as you know, is at the end of this month. It's envisaged, I think, that the planning white paper will bring changes to legislation, which will require parliamentary time, presumably through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, as well as work by effectively MHCLG civil servants. My guess is that that's going to take many, many months, that isn't the highest perhaps priority at the moment for the country to get that through the legislation. So I think we could be a year or two, 18 months or 2 years away perhaps from that. So in those circumstances, I can see no reason why we wouldn't be able to progress with the local plan. Like many other authorities, if we get into some of the planning reforms and we have this sort of simplified zonal system, then plans that are already approved would have to be revisited to see how they were perhaps represented. And the same could be for York, but we could be many months down the line before I think that has an effect. I guess what will come out, Councillor Carr, it's a very good question, is somebody, I'm sure, when we get back into examination with inspectors, is going to be putting that question to them. Likewise, we know that the implications of COVID on the economy and other considerations will no doubt be aired at that next phase whenever we get to it.
Thank you, Chair. No further questions. Thanks.
I think given that particular legislation, consultation seems to have the largest impact on Greenbelt in Southern Conservative wards, constituencies. I think that may have a long and tortuous road. Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair, and apologies if there's a bit of noise in the background. The joys of joining remote meetings from your kitchen table at tea time does mean that there are other people about. I just wanted to clarify, I think you did say it, Alison, but page 153, paragraph 30, it just says our intention is to submit the addendum as soon as possible. I think I heard you say sometime next month or thereabouts, but if you could just clarify that. And then I had a second question just around the homework stuff that you were mentioning, Mike.
Yes, so in our response to the inspectors that we submitted last week, which is now published as I think it's EXCYC 43, we've indicated that we would be submitting that hopefully in early November in relation to the Greenbelt topic paper addendum, the updated addendum, with an indication of the how we would be revising the annexes to that report, with the annexes to follow.
Thank you. And then just at the top of page 150, you mentioned the various bits of homework, and I guess, you know, Councillor Carr's raised the prospect of the changes to the planning system. The other big possible thing coming down the line is the local government reorganisation and devolution and what have you. And I just wondered, the joint position statement between City of York Council and Selby District Council regarding the housing market area, and obviously I think that's a sensible and coherent position to take, but is there any risk to that if Selby District Council ceases to exist or is swallowed up in a different organisation, or indeed is merged with City of York in some kind of new organisation? Is there any impact of that process on the local plan?
There could be, but how many years away that would be if it does happen is really hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think in terms of any local government reorganisations, and I worked in Cheshire before Cheshire was local government reorganisation, 7 districts and a county council, went to 2. I think then you would look to take the local plans from each constituent authority and create a new plan for those areas. I guess, you know, that whole process, I think is a few years away, and the outcome is uncertain. In the meantime, I think what is important is that, you know, we have demonstrated our sort of duty to cooperate with our neighbours in plan production. And one of the key hallmarks of York's local plan in its draft various forms over a number of years is that effectively it makes provision within the city for both employment and housing needs, and doesn't fall into the trap that in some parts of the country other plans have fallen into, in that they are seeking neighbouring authorities to actually deliver either housing or employment to support them. That becomes quite often a difficult conversation, depending on the circumstances, transport infrastructure, etc., etc. So, in short, I don't see that being something that would hinder the progress of the local plan at all.
Thanks, Mike. If I may, Chair, the only point I suppose I would make is that you're suggesting that it could be a long way down the line. The local authority is about to submit on the 9th of November, I think, outline proposals for you know, our preference on local government reorganisation. This could happen quite quickly, and I'm just wondering that if this is a key part of the homework that the inspector set that asks for you know, clarification and quite a bit of work on, if the circumstances change quite quickly, which they may, to what extent does that put a spanner in the works of this aspect of the local plan?
So the key, Councillor Crenshaw, is the time, isn't it? I mean, I understand in terms of the proposals on local government reorganisation, my understanding was that potentially looking at 2022-23 sort of time scale. I would expect we made good progress into the next phase and possibly the final phase of the local plan examination. Then will be a period, wouldn't there, that if local government was reorganised, of taking stock of whatever local plans are in force and the new authorities coming to look at planning across their areas. But in the meantime, people will have been making planning decisions through the planning committee process and development management on the basis of local plans as submitted. Don't forget also that there is an indication from MHCLG that plans should be reviewed every 5 years anyway. So that's something that we could envisage, although where you have a green belt, then you would perhaps expect that green belt to be enduring without major changes for most of the length of a planned period. So again, Councillor Crenshaw, you know, there could be issues, but there's no reason at this time to think that there were. But I'm sure, again, these things will get picked up in subsequent phases of the examination by the inspectors.
Congratulations, Councillor Crenshaw. I didn't think a discussion about the local plan could get any more complicated, but throwing in local government reorganisation and devolution has actually managed to achieve the impossible, I think. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I was intrigued by the statement 20 at the top of page 151. Last sentence, the inspector instructed to review an update of the HRA should be undertaken and that consultation with Natural England and the DIO should ensue to agree a statement of common ground. Now, my discussions with the DIO have been basically on the grounds that they're absolutely adamant that the Strensall Barracks site should be developed, and my conversations with Natural England are pretty adamant that it shouldn't be developed because of the damage to the common. How are we going to get a statement of common ground out of that, and what are the consequences if we don't?
It's likely to be quite a short document because there isn't a great deal in common. So the bits that are not agreed are probably going to be a longer statement than the bits that are agreed. But that's just the sort of title of the document that needs to be submitted. Alison perhaps can come in there.
I suspect the content of the document will just read, "We do not agree." That is our statement of common ground.
Maybe longer.
There was an acknowledgement by the inspectors that he would like to see what the DIO are proposing, what we're proposing, and Natural England's commentary alongside that. They did acknowledge at the table that it may be more of a statement of uncommon ground than common ground, but it gives a basis for future discussions at the examination session in relation to the evidence that's been submitted.
Councillor Fisher.
Yeah, the effect on the common. Clearly, the site ST35 has been taken into consideration and removed from the plan. Has great consideration been given to the sites that are a little bit further away? Because I mean, I've been out on the common today and I've been talking to people, particularly dog walkers, which is Natural England's main concern about the common, is the effect of dog walking on the common. I've been asking people where they come from, and they've been coming from all over York, simply because Strensall Common is about 12 square kilometres of open space where you can take dogs and ramble for miles. Could there be a problem with, for example, with the site north of Haxby, which is very close to Strensall Common? That will probably result in quite a lot of people from there going over. Has that been taken into consideration as far as its impact on Strensall Common as a habitat?
Alison can come in here. We've been doing a lot of work with the promoters of strategic sites across the city for them to be able to demonstrate the mitigation measures. And this is partly why the whole process has taken perhaps longer than is ideal, really. But we've had to engage with them because the claim from the DIO was obviously other people should be recognising, Councillor Fisher, as you've picked up, that people will travel in some cases some distance to go to the common to exercise, and a high proportion are dog walkers. But I'll bring Alison in for a little bit more detail on that.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, so in terms of how we've looked at the recreational pressure on the common from across the city and the development sites in the local plan, that was the issue raised in our original submission in 2018 by Natural England, that we needed to understand that a bit more. So we undertook some visitor survey work in detail across the common, and that detailed that went out as people went out to the common. There were some electric counters that were out there for several weeks to count the number of people going across the common. There were people also doing face-to-face surveying at that point when we were allowed to do face-to-face surveying. They did a number of surveys to understand, as you said, where people are coming from, why they're going to the common, how long they're there, what routes do they take, do they have a dog? That was a critical point. And the critical point about dog walking is that because it's a heathland, it's very poor soil, and that's what makes it a really good heathland. That ironically, it's got poor soil, whereas dogs and dog fouling is starting to enrich. Not to go into too much graphic detail, but enrich nutrient-wise the soil in the common. Obviously, it changes the composition then of the plant species and the habitats that are on site. The conclusion of that work was that there would be a 24% uplift in recreational pressure as a result of development in the plan, and by removing the site at Queen Elizabeth Barracks, we'd actually reduced that down to 6% increase in Strensall Common, and that was not including consideration of any mitigation across any other of the development sites in the city. So all development sites in the city are subject to our proposals in the policies in the plan with regards to ensuring there is adequate open space on site, and as we've moved forward through the process, the work that was submitted to us by the Defence Infrastructure Organisation in December, they actually submitted to us their own shadow habitat regulation assessment, a mitigation strategy, and an extra visitor survey. That visitor survey, we've had our visitor survey consultants review that work, and actually the overall conclusion has been that work supports and effectively adds a second year's worth of visitor survey data to the original data that we had in 2018. So we have 2018 and 2019 data. what we have done to look at that, so we've always identified there'd be the 6% uplift in recreational pressure as a result of the other developments in the plan. And what the new HRA has looked at in more detail is this 2 years worth of data and how we should be then looking at mitigating those through the other policies in the plan. So what the new HRA will be suggesting is or recommending is modifications to some of the strategic site policies in the plan to make sure that those sites not only meet the recreational requirements for open space, but also have mitigation in place for Strensall Common. And they can be, and that's part of an overall recreational access strategy. So there'll be, we'll be working with the developers, as Mike said, to agree that ahead of the next phase of developments, as we will be working with the DIO to discuss the outcomes of the report in terms of their site. But that work as well, what the outcome showed is that the recreational pressure uplift is much more acute the closer to the common you are. So the further, so we generally look at a 5.5 kilometre radius around the common to that's sort of where most of that's sort of the representative area of where most of the visitors come from. So we're looking at sort of most of the visitors coming from the north part of the city, and by making sure that some of the policies, the other strategic sites in the plan can mitigate, and when I say mitigate, we're looking to ensure that they include sufficient dog walks for dog walking routes and semi-natural and natural open space on site to make sure there's a limited sort of push factor. So there'll be an on-site pull factor really for dog walkers on those sites within 5.5 kilometres.
Thank you for
Good news
that.
is dog walkers will be encouraged not to travel across the city, so we'll get some environmental benefits as well out of that, I guess.
I would recommend to members who haven't read that survey work that was done on Strensall Common. It is a particularly fascinating and interesting report with more references to dog fowl and dog urine than I think I've ever seen in any council report in history. It was a fascinating piece of topic. Councillor Colwick.
Thank you, Chair. I think I probably know the answer to this, but it would be interesting to know whether any assessment has been possible through 2020. And the uplift that would have been created through the months of the pandemic, because the use of Strensall Common has only increased over these last months. And I'm one of those who falls into the category of living on the north side of York and visiting the Common quite regularly. I just would be interested if there's any has been any possibility of assessing the footfall and the use of Strensall Common over these last several months, but I guess the answer is probably no.
We haven't undertaken any additional survey work, but we do know that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, as Councillor Fisher referred to, that there's been an uplift in people attending the Common, and it's something to think about in terms of the future, in terms of a monitoring regime potentially of visitor pressure, to make sure that we understand what's happening as a result of development in the city and the increase, as well as what's happening now as a result on the Common.
Councillor Fisher.
I can say, through having been on the Common virtually every day for 2 hours, there has been a huge increase. It's been an absolute godsend for the people of Strensall. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people have behaved extremely responsibly, particularly because they've mostly been locals who know the Common, they know the damage it can be done to it. And I haven't seen a significant uptake in dog fouling and harassment of other animals. Has been a little, but not as much as might have been. But no, the Common has been absolute godsend during lockdown.
Okay, so I haven't got anybody else indicating they wish to speak on this item. So it is just here for noting. I think there's a sort of a bit of background. I did become consciously aware as chair that with us being in the examination process, there's a lot of back and forth with the planning inspector, and that information gets posted by law onto the council website, and so it's not an ideal way of transparency. So this was a way of sort of trying to say, well, we'll do as much as we can to get that information to the local plan working group. Councillor Taylor. You're still on mute. My sign language isn't that strong, is it? I can do the alphabet in sign language. That's about all. It would take me quite a while to spell out.
I think Councillor Taylor has to wait a moment for his laptop to catch up to unmute himself. So it can sometimes take him 20, 30 seconds. But then once he's started talking, that's it. You can't stop him.
I can. I've got the mute button as well. Have you got a chalkboard, Councillor Taylor? You could sort of... I could take this opportunity to point out that Councillor Rowley unfortunately had to leave the meeting at 6:30 and has passed his apologies on. Between that and filling time, unless anybody can sing. Alison, you got your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to add, Chair, that in terms of the updates that go onto the website, just while we're waiting for Councillor Taylor to come back to us, in terms of the updates that we have to the website, the programme officer does give us updates to put on the website. So most of the important updates are on the face of the web page, but there are other documents that aren't placed in those updates. So we're directed as to the wording that can go on the web page. So it's always worth checking the actual examination library itself in terms of the update. So I've attached for you the 7th of October version to this report. We're now up to, I think there's been 2 additional updates since then. One to add in our response to the one to add in the response from the inspectors last week, and one to add in some communication the inspectors have had with a representative to the process as well.
Thanks. I did note the library itself is 11 pages long, which just tells you something about the level of information that's on there. Can I unmute you, Councillor?
I think
no.
I'm sorted now.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it says you're muted, but you're not. So
I appreciate everybody's patience. Thank you. There was just a very quick point, really, or perhaps an ask. It's not a big deal. Do appreciate this report being in, Chair. I mean, the local plan's been quite the saga for all sorts of reasons. I'm sure you'll agree with that, even if we might debate the reasons. But I wondered if there's any possibility of a plain English potted history of the local plan to be made available on the council website, because I mean, even as a councillor, this is a nightmare, and I have no idea how lay members of the public will try and digest this, and it's quite the challenge. It's not an easy job, but is it something that we could look at, a sort of plain English guide to where we are at, why we're here, and what's gone on in the last few years? Is that something we can do?
It's one of the many novels I've considered writing when I retire from politics. In terms of, I mean, we just started in 1954, so it's some significant research to go on to find anybody.
I've got the 1948 version as a PDF, I think. Chair, happy to look at that, but the first priority, I think, for Alison and the small team is to get this stuff submitted. But happy to do that. But one of the problems again is that this is sort of semi-legal stuff that you have to, some other things you can't avoid. The statement of common ground, for example, even if it's a statement that we don't agree with somebody, still has to be called a statement of common ground. So there are some things that are, unfortunately, Councillor Taylor, outside our sort of direct control, that we have to make sure that we follow due sort of legal process and MHCLG guidance on these things. But happy to take that away to have a look at it. But I think it's just how far back we go. I think probably keeping things up to date and the way the next steps might be the first thing. Obviously, people have researched it, as Councillor Eyre says. Stuff goes back to the 1948, 1956. There's a long history in York, but he hasn't stopped the city moving forward, and he hasn't stopped us being able to have new development that we can properly consider through the planning process.
That was a well-rehearsed final statement.
It wasn't at all.
And I think even if we did get somebody to do all that, whether anybody would agree what happened at every particular stage might be another challenge. I think I'll give it a whirl. Maybe if we can find a retired planning officer, Mike, that left the authority about 6 or 7 years ago and retired, they might be interested in doing that one. Okay, so taking that on board, are we all happy to note the report? Okay, I have no urgent business, so at that point, I'm happy to declare the meeting closed. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Cheers.